Your sister will stand beside me tonight. Grace Whitmore stopped with one hand on the silver door handle, certain for one stunned second that she had misunderstood. Beyond the carved doors of the Royal Moon Hall, hundreds of voices murmured beneath crystal chandeliers, string music drifting through the chamber like a promise she had been raised to believe belonged to her. Then King Nathaniel Hawthorne spoke again, quieter this time, but not quietly enough. Grace was suitable. Emily is the woman I want. Suitable. The word landed harder than anger would have. Grace's fingers slowly loosened from the handle. She had spent 3 years preparing to stand beside Nathaniel. 3 years learning court customs, pact treaties, royal ceremonies, and every expectation placed upon the woman promised to a king. Tonight, she wore the pale silver gown chosen for the announcement, its sleeves embroidered with tiny white moons by women who had congratulated her all week. Yet through a door barely 2 inches thick, she had just learned that everyone's plans had changed except hers. The council expected Grace, an older voice warned. The Whitmore agreement names the eldest daughter. Nathaniel gave a soft, impatient sigh. Then the agreement can be amended. Emily carries herself like a queen. Grace, a pause. Grace held her breath despite herself. Grace knows how to endure disappointment. Something inside her became very still. Footsteps approached from behind, and Grace turned to see her mother crossing the marble corridor, face pale beneath carefully applied powder. Margaret Whitmore slowed when she saw Grace standing there. That single hesitation told Grace everything. You knew, Grace whispered. Her mother glanced toward the doors. Not here. How long? Grace, please. There are nearly 400 guests inside. How long? Her mother's mouth tightened. Since yesterday. Grace looked past her and saw Emily at the far end of the corridor. Her younger sister stood beneath the golden sconces wearing a royal blue ceremonial cloak. Grace recognized it immediately. She had been fitted for that cloak 2 weeks ago. Emily's eyes met hers, then dropped. No triumph. No apology either. Only guilt. The doors opened before Grace could speak. Warm light spilled across the corridor, and the herald announced the Whitmore family. Every instinct told Grace to turn around. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked inside. Conversations softened as she passed. Wolves from the oldest families watched her with polite curiosity, unaware that the future they expected to witness had already been rewritten behind closed doors. Nathaniel stood near the raised royal platform, handsome and composed in black formal dress, his expression revealing nothing when he saw her. Emily entered moments later, and the room changed. Grace felt it before anyone said a word. The glances, the whispers, the sudden realization spreading from table to table as everyone noticed the royal cloak resting on Emily's shoulders. Nathaniel stepped forward. Tonight, he began, the crown begins a new chapter. Grace heard nothing after that. Her heartbeat was too loud. Then, across nearly 60 feet of polished marble, she felt someone watching her. Not with pity, not with curiosity. She turned. At the far edge of the hall sat a man dressed entirely in dark charcoal, broad-shouldered, motionless, one hand resting loosely against the arm of his chair. No crown marked him. None was needed. Damian Blackwood. The Lycan Alpha Nathaniel never mentioned without lowering his voice. Every seat around Damian stood empty. His gray eyes were not on Emily. They were on Grace. For several seconds, Grace forgot the rest of the room existed. Damian Blackwood held her gaze without moving, and somehow that made his attention feel heavier than Nathaniel's announcement echoing through the hall. Then applause rose around her. Grace turned back toward the royal platform just as Nathaniel extended his hand to Emily. Her sister hesitated for the smallest moment before stepping forward. Margaret Whitmore stood only a few feet away, smiling with the careful expression of a woman trying to survive a public disaster without admitting there was one. Grace felt the eyes begin to shift toward her. Curiosity first, then understanding, then pity. She hated the pity most. Nathaniel continued speaking about unity, loyalty, and the future of the crown, but every polished word sounded hollow now. When he finally looked directly at Grace, his expression softened as though he expected gratitude for being gentle. Grace, he said, loud enough for the nearest families to hear. I trust you understand this decision was made for the good of everyone involved. A silence opened around her. Her mother's fingers closed around her wrist. Just bow, Margaret whispered. Do not make this worse. Grace looked at the hand holding her, then at Nathaniel. 3 years of obedience seemed to gather inside that moment. 3 years of being told patience was dignity. 3 years of smiling when decisions were made around her instead of with her. She slowly pulled her wrist free. For everyone involved? She asked. Nathaniel's confidence flickered. Grace, this is neither the time nor the place. I agree. Her voice stayed calm. That calmness seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Grace reached for the silver chain at her neck and lifted the royal engagement ring that had rested there since Nathaniel first offered it to her. She had worn it close to her heart because court tradition forbade an unbonded Omega from wearing a royal ring on her hand before the final ceremony. Now she unclasped the chain. The tiny sound seemed impossibly loud. Emily took a half step forward. Grace, I never wanted to hurt you. Grace looked at her sister. There were 1,000 things she could have said, but none of them would change what had already been chosen. Then do not ask me to make this easier for you. Emily went still. Grace crossed the polished floor toward the royal platform and placed the ring on the lowest marble step. Nathaniel stared down at it. What are you doing? Returning what no longer belongs to me. A murmur moved through the hall. Margaret whispered Grace's name in warning. Grace ignored it. Nathaniel lowered his voice. You will regret embarrassing the crown. Grace met his eyes. I am not the one who changed the arrangement in front of 400 guests. Before he could answer, an elderly voice sounded from beside the ceremonial altar. Then the ancient law applies. Everyone turned. Royal Elder Thomas Alden stepped forward, leaning on his carved oak staff. Nathaniel's face hardened. That law has not been invoked in generations. It has not been needed. Alden looked at Grace. A woman formally released during the moon ceremony may choose another unbonded alpha present before the final bell. The room became utterly still. Grace felt her mother's shock behind her. Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. Then, almost against his will, his eyes moved toward the far side of the hall, toward the empty chairs surrounding Damian Blackwood. Grace followed his stare and understood something she had not understood before. Nathaniel was not merely uncomfortable with Damian. He was afraid of him. Grace turned fully toward the Lycan Alpha. Damian had not moved. His gray eyes remained fixed on her, unreadable and patient. Behind her, Nathaniel spoke with sudden urgency. Grace, think carefully. She took one step away from the royal platform, then another. Grace kept walking. Each step carried her farther from the royal platform and deeper into a silence so complete she could hear the faint sweep of her gown across the marble. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The attention of the entire hall had shifted from Nathaniel and Emily to the woman they had expected to disappear quietly. Damian Blackwood sat nearly 60 feet away, alone beneath the shadow of a stone arch, his dark charcoal coat severe against the silver banners hanging behind him. He looked older than Nathaniel, broader through the shoulders, calmer in a way that made the king's confidence seem strangely fragile. Grace had heard stories about him since childhood. Some called him the Blackwood Lycan. Others called him the wolf beyond the crown. He controlled the northern territories without asking permission from the royal court, and unlike the nobles who surrounded Nathaniel tonight, Damian never seemed interested in proving his importance. He simply possessed it. Grace crossed another 10 feet. Nathaniel came down from the platform behind her. Grace. She did not stop. Grace, this is not necessary. That made her pause. She turned just enough to look at him over her shoulder. Neither was humiliating me in front of everyone I know. His jaw tightened. I was trying to prevent a worse situation. For whom? Nathaniel glanced toward the watching court. You are emotional. Grace almost smiled. It was such an easy word. Emotional. A word used when a woman reacted to something someone else had done to her. I have been remarkably calm tonight. Royal Elder Alden remained beside the altar, saying nothing. The old law had been spoken. The choice belonged to Grace now. Nathaniel stepped closer and lowered his voice. You do not understand, Blackwood. Grace looked toward Damian again. He had not moved. Then perhaps I should. Nathaniel's expression changed. Not anger. Something sharper. Choose someone else. Grace stared at him. Anyone else, he added. That was when she finally saw it clearly. The hesitation behind his eyes. The tension in his shoulders. The way the king of the realm kept glancing toward Damian as if measuring every word. Grace had watched Nathaniel face council disputes, border negotiations, and proud alphas twice his size without losing his composure. Yet Damian Blackwood had not even stood and Nathaniel was asking her not to approach him. Grace turned away from the king. The final 20 feet felt longer than the entire walk before them. Damien's gray eyes followed her without judgment. When she stopped in front of him, she became aware of how quiet he was. Not cold, not cruel, simply waiting. Alpha Blackwood, Grace said. Her voice carried farther than she intended. Damien inclined his head once. Grace Whitmore. The fact that he knew her name unsettled her more than if he had called her Omega. Behind her, Nathaniel spoke again. Grace, do not do this because you are angry. She closed her eyes for one brief second. Then she remembered the silver ring resting on the marble step, Emily wearing her ceremonial cloak, and her mother telling her to bow. Grace opened her eyes. I am not angry enough to make this choice. Damien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Then why are you making it? She held his gaze. Because for the first time tonight, I am being allowed to choose anything at all. A murmur moved through the hall. Damien rose slowly to his full height. The empty space around him suddenly seemed much smaller. Grace lifted her chin. If the old law still stands, then I choose you. Somewhere behind her, Nathaniel drew in a sharp breath. Damien looked at Grace for a long moment, and for the first time that evening, she could not tell whether she had just escaped one future or stepped directly into another. For one suspended moment, Damien Blackwood said nothing. Grace stood before him with the entire court watching, and the silence around them seemed to tighten with every passing second. She had expected surprise, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps even the faint arrogance of a man suddenly handed a public victory over a king who feared him. Instead, Damien studied her with an expression so controlled that she could read nothing in it. Then he spoke. No, the word was quiet. It did not need to be louder. A ripple of astonishment moved through the hall. Grace felt the warmth drain from her face. Behind her, someone whispered. Nathaniel did not. Somehow, his silence felt worse. Grace remained still, refusing to let the court watch her shrink beneath a second rejection. No, she repeated. Damien stepped closer, not enough to crowd her. Only enough that his next words belonged more to her than to everyone listening. You have been humiliated, cornered, and forced to make a decision before 400 witnesses. I will not pretend that makes your choice free. Grace stared at him. She had imagined many responses on the walk across the hall. This was not one of them. The law gives me the right to choose. It does. Then why refuse me? His gray eyes held hers. Because I am not interested in becoming the weapon you reach for because another man wounded your pride. The truth of it struck too close. Grace lifted her chin. You assume a great deal about me. Perhaps. Damien glanced once toward Nathaniel, then back to her. But I know what anger sounds like when it is dressed as courage. Nathaniel finally stepped forward. Then the matter is settled. Damien turned his head. I did not say that. The king stopped. Damien reached beneath his coat and removed a small dark medallion stamped with the Blackwood wolf. He held it out to Grace. My territory lies 200 miles north of here. Take this seal. Come to Blackwood tomorrow if you still wish to speak with me. Grace looked at the medallion but did not touch it. Why? Because there will be no royal court there. No sister standing beside your former promise. No mother telling you how to behave. No king watching to see whether your decision embarrasses him. His voice softened by a fraction. There will only be you. Grace felt the words settle somewhere deeper than the humiliation of the evening. And if I still choose you, then ask me again. Nathaniel gave a humorless laugh. You expect her to travel north for this performance? Damien looked at him. Nothing in his face changed, but Nathaniel's smile disappeared. I expect Grace Whitmore to decide what she wants after everyone stops deciding for her. Grace looked down at the seal in Damien's open palm. It was simple, almost plain, nothing like the jeweled ring she had returned to the crown. She thought of walking out alone. She thought of going home with her family and hearing explanations until the betrayal sounded respectable. Then she thought of Nathaniel telling her she would regret embarrassing him. Grace reached forward and took the seal. It was cool against her fingers. Her mother inhaled sharply. Emily looked stricken. Nathaniel's face hardened. Damien merely stepped back, giving Grace space as though even now the next move had to be hers. 3 days, he said. Grace closed her hand around the Blackwood seal. I will not need 3. For the first time, something almost like approval flickered in Damien's eyes. Then Grace turned away from him, away from Nathaniel, away from the royal platform, and walked toward the doors under her own power. This time, no one asked her to bow. By sunrise, Grace had packed one suitcase and left the Whitmore estate before anyone else came downstairs. She took only what belonged to her: 2 dresses, a winter coat, a pair of worn leather boots, a small box of letters from her late father, and the Blackwood seal. Everything else could stay behind. The royal carriage offered by Nathaniel waited at the front gates, polished black beneath the pale morning sky. Grace walked past it. She hired a private car instead. If she was going north, she would arrive by her own choice. The road to Blackwood territory stretched for nearly 200 miles through pine forests, open farmland, and mountain passes where autumn had already touched the trees with copper and gold. Grace expected the farther north she traveled, the more severe the land would become. She had heard enough stories about Damian Blackwood to imagine watchtowers, rigid soldiers, and frightened villages. Instead, the first town beyond the Blackwood boundary surprised her. Children ran between market stalls. Shopkeepers greeted passing wolves by name. An elderly Omega argued cheerfully with a beta merchant over the price of apples without lowering her eyes once. Grace watched from the car window, confused. At the royal court, Omegas were expected to step aside when higher-ranking wolves approached. Here, no one seemed to remember that rule. When the car finally stopped before Blackwood Manor, Grace stared at the building ahead. It was large, built from gray stone and dark timber, but it looked more like an old mountain lodge than a royal fortress. There were no golden gates, no line of servants waiting to bow. Damian stood alone at the top of the front steps, wearing a dark sweater beneath a charcoal coat. "You came early," he said when she approached. Grace tightened her fingers around the handle of her suitcase. "You said I had 3 days." "I did." His eyes moved briefly to the single bag beside her. "I expected more luggage. Most of what I owned came with expectations attached." Something shifted in his expression. "Then you chose wisely." Damian did not ask whether she had come to accept him. He did not mention Nathaniel. Instead, he showed her a guest room overlooking miles of forest and told her she could stay as long as she needed to decide what came next. That unsettled Grace more than pressure would have. By afternoon, she wandered outside, trying to understand the strange quiet of the place. Near the eastern courtyard, she heard a child crying. A little girl sat beneath an oak tree, clutching a torn paper moon in both hands while several older children watched uncertainly. Grace approached slowly. "What happened?" The girl wiped her cheeks. "I ruined it. It was for the moon gathering." Grace sat beside her on the grass. "Then we fix it." "You cannot." It tore. Grace smiled faintly. Most things look impossible right after they break. She found a ribbon in her coat pocket and helped the girl bind the paper pieces together, turning the tear into a silver line across the moon. The child stared at it. "It looks better." "Different," Grace corrected gently. "Different can still be beautiful." The girl smiled and ran toward the others. Grace remained beneath the tree, watching her go. Only then did she sense someone behind her. Damian stood beneath the stone archway several yards away. He had witnessed everything. "You are good with frightened people," he said. Grace rose. "I know what it feels like to be told something damaged has lost its value." Damian's gaze settled on her, quieter now. "Blackwood does not believe that." Grace looked toward the laughing children, then back at him. For the first time since leaving the royal hall, she wondered whether the stories about Damian Blackwood had been wrong about more than one thing. By the second morning, Grace understood that Blackwood's greatest secret was not hidden behind locked doors. It was visible everywhere. People trusted Damian, not because they were afraid of him, but because he rarely asked anyone to do what he would not do himself. She saw it first at breakfast, when a young beta entered the dining room carrying a stack of land reports and addressed Damian by his first name. No titles, no trembling apology. Damian simply moved his coffee aside and made room at the table. Later, near the western offices, Grace watched 2 Omega women disagree openly with one of Blackwood's senior advisors over housing repairs. No one silenced them. No one reminded them of rank. By noon, curiosity overcame caution. Grace found Damian in a long study lined with maps. A wide window overlooked the valley, where dark pine forests stretched toward distant mountains. "Why does Nathaniel fear you?" she asked. Damian did not pretend not to understand. He set down the document in his hand. "What makes you think he does?" Grace leaned against the edge of the desk. "Because I have known him for 3 years. I have seen him irritated, offended, and furious. I had never seen him afraid until I walked toward you. Damien's mouth almost curved. You notice more than people give you credit for. That is not an answer. No. He crossed to a large map marked with silver pins. Nathaniel rules the Crown territories. I govern Blackwood and hold agreements with most of the northern Lycan clans. Grace studied the map. The northern region was larger than she had realized. So he thinks you want his throne. That would be simpler for him. Damien touched one of the silver markers. I do not. Grace looked at him. Then what frightens him? That people can choose to follow someone without being commanded. The word stayed with her. Damien explained that for years Nathaniel had pushed for a royal bond treaty that would place the northern clans under direct crown authority. Damien had refused each version. The clans trusted Blackwood because their autonomy remained intact. Nathaniel cannot force the treaty without risking half the realm turning against him politically, Damien said. So he needs cooperation. Grace felt something cold gather beneath her ribs. And where do I fit into this? Damien went still. That was answer enough. Tell me. He exhaled slowly. The Whitmore line carries one of the oldest legal claims recognized by the Northern Councils. A marriage between the Crown and the eldest Whitmore daughter would have strengthened Nathaniel's argument that the North was already bound to royal interests. Grace stared at the map. 3 years of lessons. 3 years of ceremonies. 3 years of being told she was fortunate the king had chosen her. He was never marrying me because he wanted me. Damien's voice remained careful. I cannot tell you what he felt, but you can tell me what he needed. Yes. Grace stepped back from the desk. Suddenly Emily's selection made less sense, not more. Then why choose my sister? Damien looked toward the window. That is the question I have been asking since last night. Before Grace could respond, the study door opened and a messenger entered, breathless from travel. He handed Damien a sealed envelope marked with the royal crest. Damien read it once. His expression hardened. What is it? Grace asked. He gave her the letter. Nathaniel was coming to Blackwood, and he was bringing Emily with him. Grace read the royal letter twice, though the words did not change. Nathaniel would arrive before sunset. Emily would be with him. No explanation. No request for permission. Only a formal notice written in the confident tone of a man accustomed to being received wherever he went. Grace handed the letter back to Damien. He thinks I will leave with him. Damien folded the paper once and placed it on the desk. Do you? She looked at him. You are asking me that seriously? Yes. There was no challenge in his voice. That made the question harder. Grace walked toward the window and watched clouds gather over the northern hills. 2 days earlier, she had believed Nathaniel's rejection was the worst thing that could happen to her. Now she understood it had only exposed how little control she had ever possessed. I do not know what he wants, she said, but I know I am tired of people arriving with decisions already made. Damien nodded once. Then I will not make one for you. Nathaniel's convoy reached Blackwood shortly before dusk. Grace watched from the front steps as 3 dark cars rolled through the gates. Nathaniel emerged first in a tailored black coat, polished and composed as always. Emily followed more slowly. The royal blue cloak was gone. She wore a simple cream coat instead, and for the first time Grace noticed how tired her sister looked. Nathaniel climbed the steps without waiting to be invited. Grace. His voice carried the familiar authority that once made her straighten instinctively. This time, she remained where she was. Nathaniel. His eyes flicked toward Damien, who stood several feet behind her. We need to speak privately. Grace felt Damien's presence, but not his interference. You can speak here. Nathaniel's expression tightened. This concerns the crown. Then speak carefully. Emily looked down. Nathaniel drew a measured breath. The council has raised objections to the ceremony. Your release was not properly documented. There is still time to correct what happened. Grace stared at him. Correct it. Return to the capital. We can restore the original arrangement. Emily's head lifted sharply. Nathaniel. He ignored her. Grace felt something inside her settle into perfect clarity. You chose Emily. Circumstances changed. Yesterday, Nathaniel's jaw tightened. This is larger than personal feelings. Grace almost laughed. It was personal enough when you wanted my sister. Emily stepped forward. Grace, I did not know he planned to reverse anything. Grace believed her. That realization hurt differently. Nathaniel continued. The Whitmore alliance must remain connected to the crown. Your place beside me can still be restored. Grace studied him. If I had gone home quietly, would you be standing here now? Silence. If I had chosen another Alpha, would you have driven 200 miles north? Nathaniel looked toward Damien. That was the answer. Grace's voice softened. You did not come for me. You came because I chose someone you cannot control. Nathaniel's composure finally cracked. Blackwood is using you. Damien spoke for the first time. Grace heard your accusation. Nathaniel turned. This does not concern you. Damien's face remained calm. Then stop speaking about her, as if she is property being transferred between men. The courtyard fell silent. Nathaniel looked back at Grace. Come home. Damien did not move closer. He did not answer for her. He simply said, she heard your request. Now hear her answer. Grace looked at the king she had once prepared to marry, then at Emily standing beside him, then at the open doors of Blackwood behind her. I am staying. Nathaniel went still. Grace did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Not because Damien told me to. Not because I want to punish you. I am staying because for the first time in years, I want to discover what my life looks like when it belongs to me. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn to the sound of wind moving through the pines beyond her window. Blackwood was still quiet when she dressed and stepped into the hallway, carrying the dark medallion Damien had given her 3 nights earlier. 3 days. The time he had promised was over. She found him outside near the eastern overlook, where the land fell away into a wide valley washed in pale blue light. Damien stood with his hands resting on the stone railing, watching the first hint of sunrise gather behind the mountains. He did not turn when she approached. You are awake early. So are you. I usually am. Grace stopped beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. No court watched them. No family waited for an answer. No king stood nearby measuring what her choice might cost him. There was only the cold morning air, the scent of pine, and the man who had refused to let her choose him when she was still bleeding from humiliation. Grace placed the medallion on the railing between them. Damien looked down at it. 3 days, she said. I remember. You told me to ask again if I still wanted the same answer. His gaze moved to her face. Do you? Grace had thought the moment would feel dramatic. Instead, it felt strangely simple. Yes. Damien studied her carefully. Why? She smiled faintly. Because you were right. He raised one eyebrow. That must have been difficult to admit. Do not ruin the moment. Something warmer entered his expression. Grace looked out across the valley. That night, part of me wanted to choose you because Nathaniel was afraid of you. I wanted him to feel what I felt. Powerless. Replaced. She paused. But that is not why I am standing here now. Damien waited. I watched how people speak to you. I watched how you listen to them. I watched you give me space when you could have used my anger to gain an advantage over Nathaniel. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the stone. You made it possible for me to decide without fear. Damien's voice grew quieter. And what have you decided? Grace turned toward him fully. I choose you. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then Damien extended his hand. Not a command. An invitation. Grace placed her hand in his. Warmth moved through her palm at once. Gentle but unmistakable, followed by a strange pull deep beneath her ribs. She drew in a startled breath. Damien went completely still. A pale silver glow appeared along their joined hands, faint at first, then bright enough to reflect against the stone railing. Grace stared. What is that? Damien did not answer immediately. His gray eyes had changed, not in color, but in expression. Wonder had broken through the calm she had come to associate with him. Damien, the mate bond. Grace looked back at their hands. You knew? No, but you felt something before. His silence gave him away. She narrowed her eyes. You did. Damien exhaled. The night of the ceremony, I felt the beginning of something. I did not know what it meant. And you said nothing. Because if I had told you that fate might be involved, would your choice have truly been yours? Grace looked at him, stunned. You let me walk away. I needed you to know you could. The silver light slowly softened between them, becoming less like magic and more like warmth. Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her throat. All her life, people had spoken about destiny as something that decided for you. Family, rank, bloodline, duty. Nathaniel had called obligation destiny because it made obedience sound beautiful. Damien had done the opposite. He had hidden the possibility of fate until she could choose without it. Grace closed her fingers around his hand. Then I choose you twice. Damien's expression softened completely. Once would have been enough. Not for me. The sun finally broke over the mountains, spreading gold across the valley. Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back at the man beside her. For the first time, destiny did not feel like a cage. It felt like an answer that had waited patiently for her to speak first. 3 months later, Grace stood beneath the same kind of moonlight that had once made every ceremony feel like a judgment. This time, she was not waiting to be chosen. Blackwood Hall had opened its doors to representatives from the northern clans, the Crown territories, and several independent pacts for the first Joint Moon Council in more than a generation. The agreement signed that evening recognized Blackwood as a sovereign Lycan territory while preserving peaceful trade and shared protections across the realm. Nathaniel remained king. Damien remained Alpha of Blackwood. No throne had changed hands. No war had been needed. Yet the balance between them was different now, because fear had finally given way to boundaries. Grace stood beside Damien near the front of the hall, not behind him. Her role was no longer ceremonial. Over the past weeks, she had helped create a council seat specifically for Omegas who had been rejected, displaced, or denied representation by their packs. The idea had begun quietly, with one frightened child beneath an oak tree and a torn paper moon. Now it had become something larger than Grace had imagined. Across the hall, Emily approached alone. She looked different without royal colors, calmer somehow. "I wanted to tell you before I leave," she said. "I am returning to Whitmore for a while." Grace searched her sister's face. "What about Nathaniel?" Emily gave a small, tired smile. "For once, I am trying to figure out what I want before someone tells me what I should want." Grace felt the old hurt between them, but it no longer controlled the room. "That sounds like a good place to start." Emily nodded, and for the first time since the ceremony, neither sister needed to apologize for choosing her own direction. Later, as the council prepared to close, a young Omega stood near the back wall with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Grace recognized the expression immediately, shame trying to disguise itself as invisibility. An elder had just announced that the girls' intended match had been dissolved, and the surrounding whispers were already beginning. Grace stepped away from her position beside Damien. She crossed the hall and stopped next to the young woman. "You do not have to leave," Grace said softly. The girl looked at her in surprise. "Everyone is staring." "Let them." Grace remained beside her until the whispers faded and the meeting continued. When she finally returned, Damien was waiting near the open doors. "You missed the closing declaration," he said. "I noticed. Was it important?" Grace glanced back at the young Omega, who was now speaking with 2 council members instead of standing alone. "Not as important as that." Damien looked at her for a long moment, then offered his hand. Grace took it. The mate bond no longer flashed with silver light every time they touched. It had settled into something quieter, warmer, almost ordinary. She preferred it that way. Together, they stepped outside into the cool night air. The forest stretched beyond the stone terrace, dark and endless beneath the stars. "Do you ever regret walking across that hall?" Damien asked. Grace considered the question. Once, she had believed that night had ruined her future. Now she understood it had only destroyed the future other people had designed for her. "I thought I was choosing a way out," she said. Damien looked at her. "And what did you choose?" Grace smiled and tightened her fingers around his. "A life of my own." They continued down the steps together, not toward a crown, not toward revenge, but toward a home they had chosen freely. And for Grace, that was more than enough.